Story 1: The Darien Scheme. For those who don't know, it was Scotland's attempt to set up a colony in Panama and link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. About 20% of Scotland's wealth was thrown at it, and it completely failed in just 2 years. Story 2: The Swedish ship Vasa. The Vasa was built in the 1620s to take advantage of the very newest in warship technology, a second row of guns. It was to be a symbol of Sweden's might and thus was decorated with beautiful statues and carvings. This ship took 3 years to build and cost roughly 5% of Sweden's gross domestic product. Unfortunately, the effect of a second row of cannons on seaworthiness was poorly understood. With great fanfare, the ship set off, experienced its first breeze, and still within full view of the city of Stockholm, capsized and sank. Story 3: The Central Intelligence Agency put a microphone into a cat to spy on communists, only for that cat to get hit by a car. I think it was about $6 million and countless years of preparation and training, only to be lost under some tires. Story 4: The Great Wall of Gorgan, built by the ancient Sasanian Empire in modern-day Iran, was constructed to protect against nomadic invaders. It was built with 100 million man-days of labor, equivalent to around 300,000 workers toiling for 5 years straight. Considering the average labor cost, material expenses, and other related expenditures, the total cost of the project could have reached an astronomical sum of approximately $130 billion in today's figures. Needless to say, it failed its intended purpose as the Huns devised techniques to overcome the wall without much hassle. Story 5: I have to go with Nanny for buying that substandard copper from Ianasir Bank in the 1700s BCE. Just a terrible decision all around, from what I've read. Story 6: I can't believe nobody has mentioned World War I. Literally, all of the world's wealthiest nations completely financially ruined themselves and slaughtered a large proportion of their young men. All of the historical consequences that followed were essentially for nothing, achieving nothing except for massive geopolitical regression, with costs from which we are arguably still reeling today. Edit. The first bit reads weird now that it's one of the top 10 or so comments. This climbed up from the very bottom, baby. Story 7: New Zealand spent about $25 million on a flag referendum. Before it started, the public was against it, saying we would never change the flag. The government persisted anyway. 2 years later, the public voted to keep our current flag. It was a massive waste of time and money for a result they should have been expecting from the very beginning. Story 8: There was no other human project of greater magnitude than the Reality Labs at Meta. For reference, its cost is comparable to the core part of the Apollo project so far, and it is only the beginning. The total cost of Meta's metaverse exceeded $100 billion in 2023. No other single project comes close to this. Capital expenditure each year: 2018, $13.92 billion; 2019, $15.65 billion; 2020, $15.72 billion; 2021, $19.24 billion; 2022, $32 billion; 2023, $28.1 billion; 2024. Expect significant reduction. Fixed the inflation adjustment as correctly pointed out in comments. In today's dollars, the Apollo program's main development was approximately $150 billion, with around $300 billion for all auxiliary projects included. Keep in mind, Metaverse is shutting down in its infancy after approximately $140 billion devoted to it. Nothing has been fundamentally accomplished other than a multiplayer Sims 4 imitation. The Apollo program landed a man on the moon within $180 billion, employing about 400,000 people and pushing the boundaries of technology in electronics, transmissions, material science, and propulsion that we inherited as a society. Story 9: World War I, a war that nobody really wanted to fight, was supposed to be a short one, and at its end, left almost every European country severely indebted or in bankruptcy. Story 10: The Acoustic Kitty Project. It was a covert Central Intelligence Agency operation during the Cold War that aimed to use a cat as a mobile eavesdropping device. Why a cat? They have a natural ability to move discreetly and blend into the environment without raising suspicion and were allowed around and inside the Kremlin. The hope was that the cat, fitted with advanced listening equipment, could wander undetected near Soviet officials and pick up private conversations. The project, which cost over $20 million, involved surgically implanting a microphone in the cat's ear canal, a small transmitter in its chest, and an antenna running along its tail. The technology was cutting edge for the time, and the idea was to create a living, undetectable spying tool. However, the project quickly ran into problems. Cats are notoriously independent and difficult to train, often ignoring commands and getting distracted. On its first test mission, the cat was reportedly sent to eavesdrop on a conversation outside a Soviet compound, but it wandered off. Some accounts suggest it was tragically hit by a car shortly after deployment. Ultimately, the project was deemed a failure, and the Central Intelligence Agency concluded that animals, especially cats, were too unpredictable for espionage purposes. Story 11. Bailing out billion-dollar companies during COVID like Delta Airlines that charged me $50 to bring a bag on an airplane instead of, training new doctors or fast-tracking those already in medical school or paying off their student loan debt. Story 12. Quantitative easing and the banking bailout. We have created a system where businesses can be too big to fail, and they can expect a bailout when they get into trouble, but when times are good, all the profits go to the shareholders. So we have privatized profit and socialized risk. This means we have effectively rigged the game for capitalism, making a system where market forces are no longer fully in play and creating zombie companies that should have folded a long time ago. Story 13. Panama Canal first attempt. The French didn't understand what they were getting themselves into, and death from mosquitoes killed off too many, so the project had to be abandoned. Story 14. Back in the 2000s, an outgoing Labor government proposed a $30 billion fiber-to-the-premise nationwide broadband network internet plan promising speeds of up to 100 megabits per second. The incoming coalition government promised a cheaper fiber-to-the-node broadband network that utilized the already installed copper wiring for just under $950 million. And now, because of that, the internet in Australia is just barely becoming able to reach speeds of 1,000 megabits per second, after a revision to the planned rollout which has cost the Australian government over $70 billion. Story 15. When COVID was in full swing and the entire trading market crashed, the Federal Reserve tried to stimulate and save our corporate overlords by injecting $3 trillion into the stock market, only for it to crash again immediately, just 2 minutes later. Story 16. I cannot believe no one has mentioned the failed siege of Rhodes in 305 to 304 BCE. Long story short, Demetrius I, king of Macedon, was afraid of the naval power of Rhodes and their potential alliance with Egypt. Demetrius decided he was going to attack Rhodes, but to do so, he would need massive machines of war. With the innovations of Alexander the Great, Demetrius bolstered and scaled them up. This man was known as the besieger for his skill in siege warfare. Demetrius invented and had the Helepolis built, a massive rolling tower on wheels. The Helepolis was a great siege tower, 130 feet tall and 65 feet wide. It sat on 8 wheels and casters so it could be moved forward, backward, and laterally as well. It had multiple stories connected by sturdy stairs, one for ascending and one for descending. Its sides were iron-plated for fireproofing and had portals that opened when the catapults fired. The Helepolis weighed 160 tons and required hundreds of men to move it via the capstan and belt drive, and thousands more to push it from behind. The Helepolis contained a variety of armaments on each of its 9 floors. 2 180-pound catapults and 1 60-pounder were on the first floor. The catapults were categorized by the weight of the missile they threw. 3 60-pounders were on the second floor and 2 30-pounders on each floor above that. The top 2 floors contained men armed with bows and dart throwers for killing defenders on the city walls. The tower's ironclad, mechanically adjusted apertures were lined with animal skins, wool, and seaweed to make them fireproof. The Helepolis was the largest siege tower of its time. When Demetrius brought the Helepolis to bear, the Rhodians knocked a hole through their own wall under the cover of night where they expected the Helepolis to attack. They then flooded the entire area with water and sewage, so when the massive tower was moved up the next morning, it became deeply mired in the mud. Ultimately, the siege failed, and Demetrius left Rhodes, leaving behind all of his siege engines. Years later, the Rhodians sold the remains of those siege engines, including the Helepolis, which earned them enough money to build one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes. Story 17. The Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. Regarding the cost, estimates vary, but it is in the trillions of dollars, with some sources suggesting around $3 trillion when including long-term healthcare for veterans, interest on borrowed money, and more. Story 18. King Louis IX spent something like the entire gross domestic product worth of France on religious relics such as a piece of the True Cross, a sliver of which said to have been from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. It doesn't take a genius to see it was a fake now. Story 19. Jeff Bezos' $42 million clock that will allegedly run for 10,000 years. The manufacture and site construction are located in the Sierra Diablo Mountains in Texas. Story 20. When the United States government bailed out Goldman Sachs after Goldman Sachs bought AIG's failing bonds at pennies on the dollar, fully knowing they would fail, and got bailed out by former Goldman Sachs employee Ben Bernanke at full face value of the bonds. It was the biggest robbery of the American taxpayer and the largest waste of money in history. Colin Powell's lie about weapons of mass destruction and the resulting war on terror is also significant. But to be fair, the United States had to respond to the September 11th attacks physically. It was just overly exaggerated. Story 21. Not the dumbest, but a personal favorite of mine. The United States military spent hundreds of millions developing the XM-29 rifle. It was basically a grenade launcher with some extra bells and whistles. They wanted it to replace the M16 rifle so every soldier would be carrying one. In a shockingly unsurprising turn of events, that is a war crime. Over $300 million later, and a single Google search could have prevented it. Story 22. Everyone here has better answers, but I have to mention Twitter. What an absolutely idiotic way to buy a company. Acquire because someone told you that you can't, fire 80% of the staff, abolish the branding completely, remove moderation support, offer worthless utilities that used to be free as part of a premium service. Then force push notifications to every single user that are really just your personal tweets. When people still won't listen to you, masquerade as an anonymous user on your own app or company, artificially inflate your own follower count, and be your own biggest supporter. Story 23. Indulgences. As in the free pass given for sins during the Crusades. You could literally buy God's forgiveness for sins past or future. I'm no accountant, but I'm pretty sure that's a waste of money. Story 24. UK voting for Brexit. This has cost billions already in lost GDP, with the eventual figure likely in the hundreds of billions as its impact compounds in the decades to come. Collective madness. Story 25. Capitalist agriculture and food distribution often result in significant waste. Every second potato is discarded, and milk is overproduced only to be thrown away. Cow hides are destroyed to maintain stable leather prices, while insecticides and herbicides for large monocrops kill pollinators and subtly poison us. This is in contrast to less intensive multicropping, which could yield higher total mass. For example, keeping pigs in an apple orchard to eat fallen apples where apple-eating beetles lay eggs, naturally controlling pests instead of resorting to spraying. Instead, pigs are fed unsold grocery store items, ground up with packaging still on, rather than employing people to remove it first. So much for labor efficiency, thanks to capitalist practices. Restaurants contribute to waste, cruelty, and exploitation throughout the supply chain, and the cost is incalculably high. Story 26. Probably not what you meant, original poster, but I've always been very suspicious of trash bags. They are a pretty expensive piece of plastic, purchased with the intent to use once and dispose. Seriously though, the Massachusetts people know the big dig. Story 27. United States War on Terrorism. It took 20 years, thousands of dead United States soldiers, about $4 trillion, and 4 United States presidents to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. Story 28. Consider the Palace of Versailles, Louis XIV's gleaming monument to absolute power. 14 billion livres poured into marble halls and mirrored galleries, while France's peasants starved in their millions. But the true waste wasn't in the gold leaf or the fountains. It was in the way Versailles transformed human nature itself into an ornate game of appearances. The nobility bankrupted themselves, maintaining the elaborate fiction of their own importance, spending fortunes on the right clothes, the right apartments, the right to watch the king wake up each morning. They abandoned their estates to crowd into tiny rooms, competing for the hollow prize of royal attention. Entire bloodlines are extinct now, having spent their last coins on silk stockings and powder for their wigs. What makes it devastating isn't the money, it's how Versailles became a machine for converting human dignity into spectacle. Aristocrats who once governed provinces reduced to obsessing over who could hand the king his shirt at morning dress. A system so perfectly designed to waste not just wealth, but the very essence of human potential. Even the king himself became trapped in the apparatus of his own glory, every moment of his life transformed into theater. 14 hours a day performing the role of the Sun King, until even he couldn't tell where the performance ended and the man began. An entire civilization pouring its resources into an elaborate performance of power, while beneath the gilt and gardens, the foundations of their world rotted away. The halls still stand, of course. Tourists shuffle through them now, phones raised to capture the excess. But what they're really looking at is one of history's most exquisite machines for wasting not just money, but humanity itself.